Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating what I think are the necessary building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. With a planetary civilization, I truly mean that I think we're at the cusp, on the threshold of coming to grips with the fact that we as humans are the dominant species on this planet. And whereas up until now, for a couple of centuries, we've been basically extracting as much from the mother organism, from which we're just a part of. And we need to understand how we can shepherd this earth for the future generations. For me, today is a very interesting podcast because it's almost like a meta podcast. What do I mean with that? I match a lot of people. It's really at the core of my purpose and also my business. And when we met, Jennifer Hill, we're in a virtual studio together, I was really mesmerized by her precision. I remember the very first call, I need to giggle now for a bit, where I think we had 25 minutes scheduled, but she came a little bit late. That's how I remember it. So we had somewhat 15 minutes. And she was directly connecting me with three people, exactly the golden needle in the haystack that I needed to meet. So I think there's something really super urgent about matching the right people, the right organizations with other people and organizations. So in that sense, it's kind of also a meta podcast, meaning reflecting, my own purpose and my own showing up in the world. Like always in the podcast, we're not directly diving into the topic, but Jennifer, I'm really curious about the human being, this like beautiful, witchy, butterfly-like creature. What made you the human being that you are, and what are two or three pivotal moments in your biography that shaped the way that you show up today? The floor is yours. Super curious to listen into a couple of pivotal moments in your biography.
Well, first, thank you, Alistair. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and your audience. And I've never been called a witchy butterfly before, so I'm going to take that as the highest compliment. Thank you.
You've never been called a witchy butterfly. Well, you certainly have something witchy when I compare you to all the mentors. All my mentors have been women, all. And they're all kind of witchy. So witchy butterfly, I've never used that terminology before, but you have something deep, mystical, interesting, multifaceted. So yeah, curious to listen into a couple of pivotal moments in your biography.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alistair. And as I often share with people, I was just on a call sharing this yesterday. We had to do, I'm part of a mastermind, and it was like, hey, tell us about yourself in 60 seconds or less. And one of the things I want to be always candid with people about is I'm a bit of a recovering jerk. When I was younger, I didn't understand people. To me, it was like Alistair got a book on how to be a human being, and you got a book on how to be a human being, and he and she got books on how to be a human being. But when I opened mine, it was blank inside. And so that literally led to years of misunderstandings, breakdowns in relationships, and yet that was coupled at the same time with this unyielding drive and ambition to make a difference in the world, to connect, to be of service. It emerged actually as early as when I was 10 years old. I wanted to be of service, and somehow or another, I wound up creating my first company at the age of 10 years old, which was a babysitting company. Now, granted, it wasn't like today where you have shares, stocks, and all the things. But I went out, I got all my certifications in CPR, I started hiring myself out. I even helped hire out other babysitters in the neighborhood at the time. And that really began my entrepreneurial journey at age 10. Fast forward about 7 or 8 years later, MTV was huge at the time, and MTV was doing a competition called I Want to Be a VJ Too. This was happening right in the heart of Hollywood in California. And you can imagine there was a line of 1,000 plus people, probably 2 or 3,000 people wrapped around the building of the studio where they were doing auditions. Well, it was a particularly ugly and rainy day that day. And so as we're all standing out there, I'm kind of doing my best to socialize and get to know other people. And I can see the rain clouds forming. And that's one of my greatest gifts, both as an entrepreneur and as a human, whether it's connecting people or connecting ideas or ventures or entrepreneurs together, is I can see things before they happen. So I'm standing there in line. I see these ominous black clouds and I'm like, it's about to start pouring rain on us. So I said to my new friend I had just made in line, I said, "Would you mind? Can you just hold my spot in line? I'll be back within a half hour," because the line was not moving. So I run down to the nearest Home Depot. I buy as many tarps as I can fit in the back in the trunk of my car. And then I proceeded to go back to the MTV line, brought all of these tarps out, and it was pouring rain on people. And I sold them for over 100% profit per tarp. So that was my second entrepreneurial endeavor. My third one failed epically. I thought I was a hot piece of crap, as my mother would have said at some point. I love my mom, but it was just a funny thing she said when I was 16. And so fast forward, I'm now 27, 28, 29 years old. I've had a lot of success working in the only real job I've ever had. And I decide, I'm going to be a world famous thought leader. This is easy. I'm like in the personal development world. I'm studying myself, working on personal development, studying human behavior. So I leave my 6-figure a year job to go open a consulting company. And I had no plan, had never taken a business class in my life, and it was an epic failure. I went from making $180,000 one year to making $5,000 the next year, though that was the catalyst that after I realized what an epic failure that was, I went and was a partner with another organization for a few short months. And that was the jumping off point that eventually led me to the first company I sold, which was in the legal recruiting space. So I always like to share with people whether it was my misunderstanding of human beings, which led me to studying human behavior for 20 years and to doing everything the work I do now holistically is based upon, or if it's the failures that we have in business or in life or in relationships that sometimes seem like, how am I going to survive this? It's such a failure. It's all here and it's all part of our story and our narrative that is here to help maybe even one other person, maybe one of you listening out there might hear this and might have an aha moment or that little glimmer of hope that will help get you to your next venture or to that relationship. Most importantly, with yourself is the main thing that I teach people. It's now what I call the golden triangle of connection. Our relationship to ourself allows for our relationship to others, which allows for our relationship to our purpose. And that's really what I'm here to do, is to help every human being on the planet have a deep, meaningful relationship with themselves, others, and their purpose.
It's not often that I have to feeling I want to slow down at the beginning of the podcast. I want to start with an intuition. So we didn't have many calls prior to basically deciding to hop on the podcast, but a common feature that I would like to explore with you is to go deeper into the pain, the biographical pain, and how deep that goes when you feel like a misfit. I can take myself as an example. Even though I didn't start my entrepreneurial journey so early, the combination of being best in class and a ballet dancer in a small town environment in the mid 80s was mildly put difficult to find my peers. When my ballet career crashed and I had to go back to that hometown, which is called Würzburg, which is kind of 200,000 inhabitants, very conservative, type Zurich flavor, is I again felt like the misfit because I already had smelled and lived the abundant freedom of the capital of Germany, which is Berlin, which I think is one of the most liberal playgrounds you can possibly explore your own adolescence. And it took me literally up until my studies, where I had for the first time the feeling there's more than maybe just a friend, like one friend or two, where I had the feeling there's a peer group. There are people who are nerding out on spirituality because I was starting my meditative practice very early, or my deep fascination with the intersection of macroeconomics and sustainability, like big picture things. So, before we dive deeper into your own purpose and how you discovered that, do you mind sharing a deeper lesson or two of pain and how difficult and dark and lonely and deep this dark night of the soul can feel? Because, yes, you're very famous, but I know you also underwent some very, very painful events, you know?
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. And okay, So around that time, I was about 10, 11 years old, and I just didn't fit in. I already knew there was something off about me, right? I was weird. I was a weird kid at school. I would spend all of my spare time either studying books in the library, that was my idea of fun, or helping the handicapped kids. And I find it ironic that about 7, 8 years ago, I got diagnosed as being high functioning on the spectrum. And that basically explains all of my young adult life of not feeling like I could understand people. Like there would be people would literally say one thing and do another. And for my brain, I call it like computer says no, computer says no. Like I couldn't figure out why would people say one thing and do another. And I thought the way maybe we get things done in life is maybe you're kind, maybe you get straight A's. And that's what I tried. I tried that. I tried to be the good girl and do everything right and follow the rules. And then I got introduced to a particular friend when I was about 15 years old. I don't know how I got on the cheerleading squad. I will always remember our cheerleading coach saying, "We're only as good as our weakest link," which is clearly Jennifer. So keep that in mind, everyone. And so around that time, one of my best friends at the time was this beautiful, popular girl. All I wanted in the world was for somebody to accept me, to want to be my friend. And the biggest hardship I would say of all of this, Alistair, was I didn't know how to be a friend to myself. I didn't know what a friendship or loving or accepting yourself looked like. I was a teenager, right? And so I saw this best friend who was popular and beautiful and had all the right things and had all the right friends. And she could often be very mean to people. And so my logical, literal brain then went, 1 plus 1 equals 2. If you're mean to people, that makes you popular. And then that's how life works. And most of all, during that time, I was extremely mean and hateful to myself. When I became a cheerleader, I actually became bulimic at that time, wound up throwing up 20 plus times a day for about a decade. And I'll always remember with this particular best friend, I think I was about 17 or 18 years old. And I so badly wanted to fit in. I just wanted to be normal. I wanted to be normal. I left high school at 16 because I wasn't normal and I just couldn't sit there and learn the normal way. So I went straight to college at 16. So here I am in college. We have a lot of friends who are like 5, 6, 7 years older than us. And we go to this party and it should be fun, right? We're out in the desert, we're drinking beers, it's a lot of fun. And I remember sitting on this mound in the desert, Alistair, and just thinking, I can't do it. I can't ever be normal. Everybody else is having fun. Everybody else, they have the book on how to be normal. And I just don't know what's in that book. And it was that moment as I sat there on that dune in the middle of the desert that I knew I would take my own life the next day. I said, I can't. I'm never going to be able to figure out what normal is or how to even try to be normal. And clearly, it's just not for me. And so I have to take my own life. So that night, we stayed in the desert. The next day, I first drove down to San Diego, where I was living at the time, to Balboa Park, where they had, a couple story high buildings. And I debated jumping off a building, but I thought, oh, I don't know about the science of this. This was before Google, of like how high up you have to jump in order to take your own life. So instead, I went to a local gas station and I bought a box of Somanex sleeping pills. So there I am driving around in my Toyota Corolla, just trying to figure out where's the best place to take my own life. And I pull off probably about 20 minutes away from my parents' house where I was living at the time. And I take the entire box of sleeping pills because I was a kid and that's what I thought could kill you at that time. And looking back, my car was half hanging off a cliff. It was precipitously edged on the edge of this cliff. But instead of dying, somehow or another, I wound up hallucinating. And I wound up wandering around this random neighborhood in the middle of nowhere. And through a true miracle and serendipity, a girl who knew me happened to be house shopping there with her boyfriend and found me out of my mind, delirious, wandering the streets with my car half hanging off a cliff, and brought me to my mom's house. And they got me to a hospital and they got me help. And not 2 or 3 years later, again, I tried. I was so miserable. I was 20 years old, $40,000 in debt. Again, just couldn't figure out how to fit in. I was using drugs every day, drinking every day, bulimic, throwing up. I hated myself with every ounce of my being. And all I wanted was to belong and to fit in. So that time I had gone down to Mexico, which was easy to do at the time, and got boxes of Valium and Xanax. And I took as many as I could. And I actually still have the note somewhere that I wrote as I was going to delirium, and my roommates found me and got me safely to my grandparents' house that time. So it's been a bit of a roller coaster, Alistair. That's why I want to do whatever I can. If there's somebody out there who feels like you might not make it, I've been there. And as one of my dear, dear friends who saved my life the third time I went through existential depression when I was going through divorce about 7, 8 years ago, was my friend Dr. Mark Goulston, who was one of the top psychiatrists in the world and wrote some of the best selling books on it, one called Just Listen. And I'll always remember Mark telling me the story of being a psychiatrist at a major hospital, and he was sitting there with a patient who was going through depression, who wanted to take her own life. And he said he sat there with her, and all he did, Alistair, was he was just there with her in the moment until, as he told it, he's sitting there with her, and being with her. And then he got so deeply in her world that all of the color drained from the room. There was no color, there was nothing worth living for. And he finally understood her perspective, and he looked her straight in the eye. The woman was looking down at her hands, and he said, "It's okay. I understand why you want to take your own life. I can feel what you're feeling." And that saved that woman's life, and Mark certainly saved mine years later. So anything we can all do to support each other when we're going through this, that's my goal, is to prevent one other person from having to go through that heartache or, God forbid, taking their lives.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Jennifer. I can really relate a lot. I was just afraid to take my life, but I spent 10 years, maybe whilst you were bulimic, I spent heavily spiritually bypassing, right? Be it through hedonistic adventures, taking copious amounts of drugs, and on the flip side of the meditation was a lot of, on the flip side of hedonism was a lot of meditation, but without it being really grounded, trying to, the classical ascension journey. I want to do a segue and start exploring something that may have been part of your own healing journey, certainly of mine, and which has become trendy only in the last maybe 5 years. People are on the spectrum. Since I was the black sheep in the family and I got tested all sorts of weird things, obviously I'm also tested, for example, on the autism spectrum. But for example, I don't have ADHD, also tested. So is there a connection in between your healing journey, your purpose, and a conversation maybe for a couple of minutes we can have about people on the spectrum? Because the funny thing is, we got connected through a worldwide movement, which is called the Octopus Movement, that connects people on the spectrum. And obviously, we directly clicked and had a connection, right? So, what's the spectrum? Right? What are all these anomalies, all these hashtags that people get? And how is that connected to your healing journey before we then dive deeper into the entrepreneurial endeavors and Opti Match and whatnot?
It's a great question, Alistair, and I've done a lot of talks around the world called Cracking the Code of Human Connections, Lessons I've Learned from Autism. And I've helped a lot of other entrepreneurs realize it, because particularly in women don't get diagnosed. It's very rare. It's They only had men that were getting diagnosed and studied men, and so it's only been in the last 10 years or so that young women and adult women are getting diagnosed by this, because we learn to mask. They've done studies on this now that show that women know how to socially, for survival purposes, mask better than men could mask, for example. So how did this impact the journey? It was only about 7 years ago. It was quite the trifecta. The year I got diagnosed of being on the spectrum, sold my first company, decided to divorce my ex-husband, who was very neurotypical, looking back in retrospect, and got diagnosed as being on the spectrum. So it was kind of like a 1, 2, 3 punch for me at that point. I would say that my healing journey first began 20 years ago when I was 23 years old, and I didn't understand how to connect with others. I really struggled with it. And a woman in a personal development class was really the catalyst, who told me, "You are one of the most powerful women I've ever met in my life, but you're using your powers to destroy people." And she said, "You need to get your shit together." And so that was the first catalyst when I was 23. Fast forward to about 13 years ago, I was introduced to two things simultaneously, one being transcendental meditation and the other being Kabbalah. Both of those things, I haven't missed a day of meditation for 13 years. I deep dive in Kabbalah and many other spiritual studies around the world. Though those two things combined then gave me the tools for inner understanding, and most importantly, being on the spectrum, which I didn't yet know, for self regulation. One of the biggest things I've noticed for the people I meet who are on the spectrum, being autistic or whatever that might look like, in particular autism, but to some extent ADHD and other neurodiverse traits, is that we have a hard time self regulating. So for me, I used to not know if I felt triggered by something or upset, I would go to one extreme or another. I just didn't know how to process the emotions, they would overwhelm me. So, learning how to regulate my nervous system via meditation, via using Kabbalistic techniques, really was the catalyst that by the time, about 6, 7 years later, after I'd already been studying all of that, I got diagnosed as being on the spectrum. It was like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, where you have this big, hairy, monster like thing that you think is controlling everything. And then you pull back the curtain, it's just this little guy back there, right? That was me. That was, for me, autism was realizing, oh, I'm not some hairy, audacious monster that can't survive in humanity. I'm autistic. Okay. Well, the moment I realized that, Alistair, that gave me freedom. My whole life, I had been just trying to be whatever textbook normal was. And and what's ironic is looking back at our team and a lot of the people I worked with, many of the people, probably 50, 60, 70% of the people I hired were on the spectrum. And I was like, I could see it in them, but it never dawned on me it was in me. And the more I've gone down the rabbit hole of understanding neurodiversity and the beautiful spectrum, to answer your question, it is a spectrum. To some extent, if you look at it from 0 to 100, and let's say 60 to 100 is on the spectrum in some way, we're all on the spectrum of being a human being. It doesn't mean any of us are good or bad or right or wrong. Though what I have found is for those of us who do identify as being neurodiverse, it gives us freedom instead of just trying to conform. It's not to say there are beautiful rules in place for humanity to help us all survive, and yet there are some rules that don't work for those of us whose brains operate differently. And I think the more that we can allow ourselves to feel empowered by that and to know that there are a vast, beautiful, just like the spectrum of colors is infinite, so too is the spectrum of people infinite. And the more we embrace that infinite spectrum and can acknowledge and appreciate all of the beautiful shapes, colors, sizes, designs that every one of us comes from, then it's from that place I think we'll all experience freedom and understanding of ourselves and others. I really, the more I've gone on this journey and deep dove into this, Alistair, what I've noticed is every human being in some way is a reflection of ourselves. Even say if I have a very neurotypical friend or colleague, it doesn't mean that I'm neurotypical, they're neurodiverse. They're just a reflection of an aspect of myself I haven't yet realized. Does that make sense?
It makes a hell lot of sense down to the granular, if I remember rightly. So 8 years pivotal moment. We separated as friends 8 years ago. And while I had read around neurodiversity, I never identified with it. And so my last deep healing journey, and ultimately always what I coined the breakthrough in trauma therapy, was the combination of somatic experiencing. So ultimately learning a set of tools to self-regulate, because much like yourself and a lot of my closest friends and obviously also partners, always were not really been able to balance our emotions, right? So it was either super hyper or super low, like depressed, or when I mentioned spiritual bypassing, trying to flee my emotions, but not really being able to process them. So
Mm.
also for me, the the last breakup 8 years ago, the breakthrough in trauma therapy, and finally accepting myself that, okay, it seems people are telling me this since earliest childhood. And instead of like trying to fit in and be normal, just saying, okay, everybody tells me I'm kind of a weirdo. I'm also kind of a witchy butterfly or a magic cat or whatever. The eagle, we'll come back to asking you about totem animals in a moment, is it greatly helped me to both liberate myself as well as understand on a deeper level who are the close friends, those who stick through thick and thin. Not like the buddies, or like the business relationships, like who makes up the innermost, most intimate part of the onion layer, the Dunbar's number, those closest around me. Let's park the totem animal thing for a bit, and I have an intuition when I want to ask you about it, because this was another very pivotal moment. But when we look at the sum total of Jennifer and your first, let's say, life phase as an entrepreneur, to then discovering at the core of who you are is like intuitively matchmaking, and it's the exit, it's your own breaking free moment, it's your own deeper reckoning with your neurodiversity. What was the spark for Opti Match, the original spark? I'm not saying like what did it evolve into, or what's the business model yet. What was the original spark behind Opti Match?
There are two parts to this that allowed Opti Match to unfold. If I'm being totally honest, after I exited the first company, I literally said, never will I ever build another company again, because as many entrepreneurs can attest, it's exhausting. It's an emotional roller coaster, having employees, running a business, the finance side of it, all of it. So I swore off building businesses. And in late 2020, about a couple years after I'd exited the first one, I was loving life. I was going on croissant hunts in Paris, hosting shows with Deepak Chopra and Don Hoffman, and just loving life. I was living in Paris at the time. And there was a woman I had met in an online spiritual retreat that year in 2020 named Moon Cho. And Moon and I had met in a Zoom room, and I'm really good at following up with people after I meet them. And she sent me a follow up like 3 or 4 months later, and she says, "Oh, you want to hop on a call?" So we do. And she tells me about this platform she's creating at the time called Om Heals to match therapists with those they work with. And she's like, "I'm looking for an advisor." And so that's how I got kind of hooked. Was Moon said, "Oh, I'm looking for an advisor." I was like, oh, "Okay, I'll pray, I meditate, advising. Okay, I can do that. That's not building another company. I'm good." So a month or two goes by and I'm advising her, and she's like, "I actually really need a co-founder and I think you're it." And I'm like, "Oh geez, I swore I would never do this again." So, but at that point she had me hook, line, and sinker because I really liked the idea of what she was doing. And I said, "Okay, one caveat here. If we do build this, if I consider being your co-founder, I will not build anything without Julian Adler." So Julian is my neurodiverse, amazing co-founder of what we're now doing with Opti Match, who helped me sell the last company. He's a genius. He's the one who helped me figure out how not to be a jerk. Like, he literally read my emails for an entire year and is like, "Let's soften the language. Let's make you more approachable to human beings." So I couldn't have sold the first company or gotten where I got without Julian. So I insist to Moon that Julian comes in. So we begin discussing the parameters of what this matching software would look like. And Julian's an expert in all things human design and human behavior and all of that. And we go through a lot of different things. And one day Julian's on the call with us. He says, "You must, Jen, we must use your intuition as the catalyst for this algorithm, and we'll turn it into a software." And I was like, "What?" How do we turn my intuition into a software? Thank God Julian's a brilliant mathematical genius. So he and Moon and I spent 8 months coming up with a very, very, very complex questionnaire. We tested it, we retested it, we brought on psychiatric advisors to help us with the whole process. And that was really the catalyst. Is Jules gets all the credit for it. Is he was the one who said, "Let's create an algorithm that mirrors your intuition." And that's really our goal. Is I give away thousands and thousands of referrals just for fun, as you experienced on our first call. It just brings me great joy. And so Julian said, "Why don't we create this into a scalable SaaS algorithm and tools that can help serve humanity?"
I love it. It again feels so aligned that when sometimes you prepare for something, and then I don't know if it's fate or karma. I think it's all just words for something that I don't think we will ever figure out. It's a big mystery. We're making this experience in a speck of a very short lifetime. Then we're on the deathbed. And after that, we basically don't know. A lot of people pretend to know. I'm more of those who says we basically don't know, right? Reincarnation, maybe. The heavens, don't think so much about it. Hell, not so probable at least. And so when I look at the core of your purpose and the joy that I sense, it seems it took you a very long while. I always say my healing journey started at age 17, reading Siddhartha, losing myself meditating for years and in monasteries in India, and 37, the breakthrough in trauma therapy. And we're same age-ish, right? I never ask you your age, but presumably ish, like same age-ish. So when at the core of your purpose is just this joyful, magical creature that wants to match people, and suddenly this gets like, like supported by AI and algorithms, it's like, I think there's a couple of questions attached to it. So first of all, I would say the matchmaking is completely values agnostic. Sure, you can sell that to the weapon and arms industry or whatever type of shady thing you may not be liking. Do you have, in terms of the clientele, a certain focus that you offer your services, or was it more opportunistically, like sensing into a network who wanted to book the services? Let's maybe start with that, like kind of, because matchmaking everybody wants, right? Especially when it's supported by a genius like you. So yeah, how did the product market fit? How did that work out?
Great question. So when we were first birthing the concept, Moon's original idea was this Om Heals platform, which was to match therapists and coaches with those they worked with. So of course, data sets need data. You can't build an algorithm and test it unless you have a data set to test it against. So we began building this platform called Om Heals, where we had 100 therapists, coaches, practitioners from around the world that I personally vetted every one. That was a lot of fun just playing with the algorithm on that end, because obviously I did not match with everybody. And there was one lady in particular I will always remember, where I get on a call with her and I hadn't gotten her data. So it wasn't that I had her data and it was confirmation bias and I didn't like it. All I knew is I liked this woman socially. The moment we tried to do a therapeutic session, I remember I was rocking back and forth, like, please have this stop. This is the worst conversation ever, because I just couldn't receive what she said. What I often say to people is, our motivators allow us to feel natural affinity and psychological safety, and also have this repelling effect where sometimes it's like one person speaking apple and another speaking orange. And even though you both speak English, you literally can't hear each other. So in this particular case, this lady and I do a session, most painful session I've ever done. She's a darn good therapist, just horrible for me. 2 days later, I get her results. She is exactly oppositely motivated to me in every area, plus in the assertiveness scale. So it's just a lot of fun exploring that. Well, fast forward, we create this Home Heals thing, we get some traction, we're getting ready to get our first investors, we get to an 87% satisfaction rate, about 750 respondents, 100 therapists, 144 sessions. We have good data. I go to pitch the first investor, and he's like, I don't give a crap about your marketplace, but if you're as good as you say you are at matching, you're thinking about this all wrong. Screw your little marketplace. You need to make this available to all of humanity so everybody can match across all industries, to your point. So it turned out that a CEO I was mentoring at that point was on that global pitch that I was doing. And he private messages me in Zoom. He's like, Jen, you have been so instrumental as a mentor for me. I will project manage the whole thing for you for free and do it at cost. Does that interest you? So whoosh, we're off to the races building the software that is now Opti Match. So then we began using it. And originally we thought we would still go the medical route. It's still one of my dreams, is to be able to apply this. Imagine that every health insurance provider, the BetterHelps, the Talkspaces, all of these incredible companies around the world were using a software like this, where instead of matching on superficial things, we could match you based on psychological safety and alignment. It's a huge issue in mental health. As we went down that path, though, we realized we need more scientific evidence and research in order to do more R&D, so that way we can have empirically validated scientific studies aside from the loose study that we did ourselves. So we tabled that, and at that time we started getting a lot of interest in the consulting space. So I went into one company that was valued at about 30 million when I started working with them. We reorganized the whole team based on everybody's motivators, because we find this works in who you work with, who's your coach, who's your therapist. And then within a couple of years, they were valued at $100 million. So we do it with companies, to answer your question. We do it with communities. There's been a lot of interest, like, for example, the Octopus Movement, who you mentioned, is one of the communities of 10,000 members that we work with, where we intermatch their members amongst each other. One of the most surprising things that's happened in the last 6 months, which we didn't anticipate but probably should have, is events. So I was on Necker Island for the first time in September of last year, And at Necker, the friend who was putting on the event said, "Why don't we use your software to match everybody here at Necker in real time?" I was like, amazing. So I start matching everybody on the island. And one of the guys who was there was Vishen Lakyani from Mind Valley. And he said, "Jen, I love this. We got to bring this to one of my events." So a month later, I'm in Ibiza and we're using our software at one of their A-Fest events to match everybody. And then fast forward, we're getting more and more interest in events. So right now, our primary focus is communities and events because there's a lot of crossover. Though I do have companies that startups. I just did it for a 500-person company where we do analysis of teams and stuff like that. So the predominant is community and events, though we do some consultative work for companies and startups to help them better match teams.
So we won't do the biz dev part because I love business development. That's my secret sauce. Matchmaking and business development. I have a huge roster of ideas, so we will simply talk about that after your Valentine's a couple of days off. And I want to leave it there because it's so juicy and rich. Communities, events, and startups, like the founding teams, the chairmans, the investors, the alignment for raises, how that matches with, I would say, certainly capital groups and their portfolios to de-risk their investment. So there's a very juicy, interesting sandbox that I definitely wanna yeah, book a slot with you. Can you share something? I mean, it's a proprietary software. Um, can you share some of the magic sauce? And I want to start with what has helped me. So my ballet career crashes. I'm 17. My father puts me in front of a fully realized Buddhist monk. That's the mala I'm wearing. So it's not only for the fashion of it. I spent like 22 years with that guy up until he died in like his late 90s. I don't know exactly, 96, 98. So, okay, Zen Buddhism. There's a whole roster of, I would say, spiritual techniques, some of which rather discard maps, and some of which are very, let's say, rich or heavy in the tapestry. So I'm new to the Kabbalah. I just received an initiation like 6 months ago, 7 months ago. And it was really interesting to sense all the other frameworks I have. So I got exposure to obviously the normal disc profile, human, what is called Myers-Briggs type indicator, a disc profile. I worked for at least a decade with the Enneagram, which for me was the most profound one. Um, then human design, and then out of human design, which was what was my first mentor, a very renowned figure in the international coaching space, and then she switched to Gene Keys.
Mm.
So I would say I haven't consciously, I never did so much reading about it because I'm such a mental creature. I rather always wanted to, okay, I'm in a session, you just throw stuff at me. If I cry, if I scream, whatever, I just want to learn. And then I usually work with that typology, that map for a couple of years up until I have the feeling I've arrived at a new, what I would call homeostatic balance in my own system. I've mastered something and I'm becoming aware. And the mirrors in my close surroundings, meaning my family, my old friends, my business partners, also are like, you've become somebody else. You've grown, you've overcome certain like repetitive traits that were bugging you, right? Which I think is the general path I think that we're on as human beings, and then we basically die, and then this chapter as the lived human experience in this specific body with the name Alistair is closed. So anyhow, these were many words, but in your secret sauce, do you mind sharing with the listeners some of the ingredients without obviously like open sourcing like the whole of the magic secret sauce?
Of course, yeah. So the bits I can share, anybody would find out if you go to om.app/survey. Anybody can go. If you're not even a paying business client, any consumer can go and just try it out and see what it says about what your motivators are. So, a little bit behind the secret sauce is when I was in the recruiting business, I started to notice something. Again, remember, I didn't understand people. So, I had to like study them like I was a scientist for 20 plus years. And what I started to notice is if I put person A in front of a client, that they would respond differently than if I put person B. So then that got me wondering, well, what is it that has person A get along perfectly with this person and person B wind up in what I call an accidental adversarial relationship with them? And after studying this for 15, 20 years, what I began to notice is it's our motivators. If you're motivated, if I remember your profile right, Alistair, I think you're motivated most by information, which makes sense. You're very logical, very driven by facts. That's normally my second highest motivator. So I would be able to tell a great example of this was a general counsel I was getting a job for. I was recruiting for the startup company in LA, and there was a guy who was very highly motivated by information. How did I know that? Well, he asked a lot of questions. He was very thorough, very detailed, liked to take his time with things. So I started to notice that. Now, by the time the offer came for the client, it's not that he even had the awareness to say, I'm going to need this. I had the awareness long before we had a software to cold read, analyze him, and tell the client he's going to need a week to consider it. He will have 100 questions. I'm not exaggerating. And if you put 1 ounce of pressure on him, he'll turn down the offer. Went precisely as I said it did. And so it's funny because, of course, sales tactics, oh, make people take the job. No, I would individually analyze each person and ascertain their primary and secondary motivator. So fast forward, when we develop the software, we really look at four main areas of motivation. And the next iteration of our algorithm, which we're developing, will be deployed in the next 6 months to 9 months or so. We'll go deeper into this. But I've noticed that people are motivated by fun, information, achievement, and other people's needs. And then there's an assertiveness element that is integral to that. How assertive or not assertive you are can have your chart look totally differently than if you're more assertive versus less assertive. So how does this play out? So on our system, there's a scale of 0 to 40. 40 is the highest you can possibly get, 0 is the lowest, and 20 is the average. In terms of that, we measure your motivators. Now, as you would imagine, in a bell curve, there's, plus 40 minus to 0, 20 being the average. People who are between 15 to 25, or what actually technically 16 to 24, are what we call harmonizers. They tend to get along well with a lot of people because they fall right in the middle of this bell curve. So you're going to get people, we measure 5 points above or below is what we consider an Opti Match, your numbers. So if you're within that general mid range, you're going to have a lot more matches than somebody who's really far out and is an outlier in either which way. So what happens is we study this and then we overlay your motivators with somebody else's motivators along with your assertiveness factor. And that tells us with a high degree of certainty how psychologically safe you're going to feel. One of the things that I love to share is Google did a project called Project Aristotle in 2012, where they sought out to find what is the number one factor in team success? What is it that has some teams be wildly successful and other teams fail? Turns out the number one factor was not people who went out for drinks or lived in the same area or were the same age. Psychological safety. So that's been the driving motivator behind all the research we've done in my life's work is understanding what has us feel psychologically safe. Now, the one funny thing about this that we can't explain, and we didn't design it for this, but people always ask us about it, is people are like, oh, can we use this for dating? I'm like, people, we didn't design this for dating. However, we've had such big use cases now of lots of groups and couples and married couples and so forth. So what's funny about that is 70% of happy couples that we found match perfectly according to our algorithm. Exactly what you would expect, 0 to 5 points above or below. It's so sweet. Even my mom and dad were that way. A lot of happy couples, you might have 7 points variability in one area. What's hilarious though is 30% of couples choose somebody exactly opposite to them. And it's that old adage, opposites attract, where normally that would drive a person crazy in a business or, a therapeutic relationship. For whatever reason, in romance, it works. It's that old like spark sort of thing. So we don't have any scientific data on that because we haven't fully researched it, but I would love to have a use case where
Please,
we
I need
say,
since just taking a very different route, the podcast, but I don't mind. I need to also share something because the odd thing is also in Germany, there are really two sayings for romantic couple. It's like opposites attract each other and like gleich und gleich gesellt sich gern, which literally translates as like the same are a good match. So it was
yes.
very interesting that after first love, 5 years, early marriage, 7 years, and then 7 years of my third long partnership, when I was 37, I wrote down and I vowed and said, Alistair, in this life, will never again sign into a romantic relationship dating the opposite. So for me, it's such a relief. We're only 2 years a couple, that I met a woman that's almost telepathically has similar character traits,
Yes.
because the tension of attracting the opposite and all the learning curve and all the, let's say, inner work as a couple and the couples counseling, the joint therapeutical sessions, and trying to time and again find that Venn diagram, that like place in the middle where you finally have the feeling you match. So anyhow, this was more a riff from my own biography. Let's dive deeper into Opti Match. So doesn't feel like you're building that for an exit, but maybe also not excluding. Um, it feels like you're still early in the journey, but you have the traction. So companies, events, and what was the third one? Companies, events,
Communities. So like
and communities. Um, Can you give the listeners an outlook? Where's the company currently standing? And then I love this Horizon 1, 2, 3 framework. What would happen if, right? The next, let's say, a year, then rather the next 2 to 3 years, and then like big picture moonshot. What happens if this really becomes a wildly successful company, and if your matchmaking genius gets incorporated into a lot of other purpose-driven organizations?
beautiful. Yeah, great questions. So let's go through the if when scenarios. So assuming, what we're doing right now continues, there are going to be three major things that will happen in the next year in addition to what we're already doing. One, what we're doing is servicing the clients that we talked about, and we're about to build out the event functionality for a lot of the companies that want to use this for events. Some of it's done manually now, so we want to automate that and make it easier for our clients to do. So building out the event functionality, one of the things I'm most excited about is, as I just mentioned, anybody can go to om.app/survey and you get a report of how you're motivated. Yet what everybody always asks me is, oh, I want my girlfriend to do it. Oh, I want my best friend to do it. I want all these people to do it. So one of the next iterations of the software that we're going to go into development on will have, when you put in your email address and you say, oh, okay, here's your results, you can say, oh, I want to see how I match with my best friend, my colleague, my whoever, and you get a complimentary report. So we're going to add that functionality. Another one that's on our vision in the next year is to allow people to check a box that says match me with others around the world. So what my natural spidey sense does right now, I'm doing this while I'm on calls with people, but imagine your motivators are there, somebody else's motivators are there, and you're both interested in building companies, or you're looking for a co-founder, or you're interested in music, whatever it is. Then we'll match you not only primarily on the motivators, but with a secondary additional element of interest. And then you'll be able to check a box, and that'll be more subscription based. It'll say like, oh, I want to receive 3 new matches a month, or 5 new matches of potential friendships, business associates, etc. a month, right? The next big thing in the next year is to release the second iteration, the next version of the algorithm that Julian's been working arduously on, that will be even more refined. So right now you get a lovely report, says you're motivated by this, these are the things to watch out for, these are your strengths. And Julian's done an incredible job of breaking each one of these down into 7 micro steps that says, are you a towards, or are you an away first? Are you a yes first? Are you a no first? So all of this is going to be encapsulated in the next version. The bigger goal of what we would love, love, love to see this happen, to see what would happen with this, is to have a JavaScript plugin. So imagine, Alistair, that if you're on LinkedIn, imagine you're on Indeed looking for a job. Imagine this, that you would actually be able to wave your cursor over another person's image or their LinkedIn profile or their Facebook, and it'd say you're a 70% match or an 89% match with this person. So that's the long-term vision, is the social element of it, in addition to the business to business side, which we're already doing.
I have a hard time not going into biz dev now, um, because it's so universally applicable and provides a clear value add to a myriad of industries. I mean, job searches being the one, one level higher, like on a CISO chairman board, anchor investor, obviously in the whole funds of funds. What what comes more into my heart is, because this was very much the business lady, what's your heart's desire? So this grows, the company grows, you have a strong EBITDA, you have amazing other people joining the company, you're wildly successful, you're earning good money. What does your heart want? Because the Opti Match is values agnostic. You can Opti Match very nasty things and make them more efficient and like the dark side of the force more efficient. I strongly believe in this dichotomy, right? I'm not flagging that, right? But it's just saying it's part of my ontology that I truly feel there are certain decisions in life that you need to base on values. And my values always, that's how I was raised by my father, is always asking, how can we be part of a wavelength to steward spaceship Earth for the many generations after us. So I would say at least 7. So yeah, what does your heart want, and what may be a contribution from Optimatch for this like transition towards a planetary civilization?
I love that question. And really, from the bottom of my heart, my dream is to connect 1 billion people. And that really, it begins, there are two parts to this. As I started off with the golden triangle of connection, part number one, which so many of us don't even realize, is the self understanding. Alistair, you understand that. You and I have been on this journey. You have to understand yourself. That allows us to connect more deeply to others. So, part one, yes, we have this analysis that helps you to have better insights into yourself of what your triggers might be, et cetera, et cetera. But part two is our dream. Is I wish from the bottom of my heart, Alistair, I have the most magical, wonderful relationships with everyone in my life. From my mom, my sister, my friends, my business partners. I was just given one of the greatest gifts I could have ever been given 2 weeks ago. A super connector friend of mine out of Australia is like, Jen, I have a gift for you. I said, okay. He said, go in your WhatsApp. Okay. I don't even think about it. I introduced him to 32 people over the course of a year. He put them all in a WhatsApp group for me and called it Jennifer K. Hill's Tribe. And everybody supports each other now. People are sharing resources, helping each other. And that is what I want to catalyze with OptiMatch. Imagine, one, that we understand ourselves and that we have the tools for the inner knowing so we can be more deeply, intimately connected with others. Two, what if part of it is just a mismatch? So many of us are connecting with people based on our control dramas. If you've ever read the book The Celestine Prophecy, I just wrote an article lately and posted this on LinkedIn. There are 4 power dramas and control dramas that we're all playing out: poor me, instigator, interrogator, and aloof. We're often choosing friends, bosses, business partners, romantic partners based on these control dramas unconsciously. Self awareness contributes to that. But again, the more, what if I could naturally match you with people who were similarly motivated in business, create less friction, more harmony? It's one of my favorite things about living in Lisbon is that the people here are naturally more understanding, accepting. It's rare you ever hear a horn get honked. What if we could catalyze that for 1 billion people around the world to all have deep relationships? It might be the best friend. Also with this loneliness epidemic, we're all more disconnected than ever before because of social media, technologies, smartphones, AI, etc. What if we could reconnect people? That's my dream. Reconnect people to themselves and to one another and their purpose. And that's what I see the future of OptiMatch being.
I love big picture moonshots. So I would say 1 billion maybe is Horizon 3, maybe. Um, I will go first and then ask you the question. My biz dev in me tells me in between the Horizon 1, the Horizon 3 is a Horizon 2. So for me, it feels more like Optimatch inside, right? So it's very big communities, evolutionary leaders, Deepak Chopra, people like that. It may be partnering with Vishen Lakiani, let's say on a software API basis, I'm part of this biggest meditation online community, Insight Timer. I think it's 20 million or so. So I sense the Horizon 2 is much like Intel Inside or something like that. Is like Opti Match Inside, where you have established communities, you're trying out a test bubble, and then you're changing the lives, let's say, saving, matching the lives of, let's say, 10,000 at a time before
Yeah,
you then, have the algorithm figured out to jump from, let's say, chords of tens of thousands to millions. That's where I would sense the horizon to reach a billion.
100%. You're on point with that.
Yeah. Beautiful. Um, I think the only thing I intuited was that it's rather going to be a short and very condensed podcast. The average is 50 to 70 minutes, but sometimes it's really 80 to 90. Um, I don't think there's anything much left from my side. Eager to share some biz dev whenever it feels appropriate. Um, Grateful having met you. And if there are ways where I can be of support through my network, some intros, whatever, like I said, mainly on the biz dev side, I'm happy to share a conversation. Um, what would be last words when people, those few, that listen to the very end of the podcast? What is almost like a wish or a prayer? I pray every day. What would be something from your side to end the podcast?
My wish for every one of you is that you go in the world and that you see the light in yourself. That when you see yourself in the mirror, you don't see your features or your hair color or your skin or your eye color or your gender, but that you see that you are a being of light and that you are here to shine your light. And most importantly, to recognize the light in one another. That is what we're all here to do. About a month or two ago, I was shown this in a beautiful meditation. If I'm being really honest, I don't think I've ever shared this publicly before, Alistair, but I used to have this fear when I was a little girl and a reoccurring nightmare that I wouldn't save the world. It started when I was 5 years old and it went on, and I'd be floating off on a piece of earth knowing I didn't fulfill my mission. And when I was doing this particular deep meditation, sober one day at 10:30 a.m. on a Thursday, all of a sudden I was reminded that it's not about saving anybody. We're all already whole, complete, and perfect. Though, if we can recognize the light in ourselves, that innate goodness, that inherentness that gives us all the ability to speak, to act, to think, to be kind to one another. And then for the people who have forgotten about it, maybe somebody else is having a really hard day, maybe they've lost their job, a friend, money, whatever it might be, can we recognize that light in ourselves and in one another and help remind each and every one of us that we're light? That's it. And like the light, we are here to shine, to expand, to grow brighter. And there are going to be times, as one of my teachers Kabbalistically says, where we're going to try and plug 1,000 watts of light into 100 watts and it's going to short circuit. And we're going to have to break that light bulb and rebuild it. But know that every time something breaks, every time you're going through heartache or something you feel like you're not going to survive. I had one of those moments earlier this week. When you go through that, you're going to break, you're going to shatter your vessel, you're going to shatter your capacity to hold that light that is you, and you're going to rebuild it. And just like kintsugi glass and kintsugi art in Japan tells us that we can take a beautiful piece of pottery or cup or vase that's been shattered into a million pieces, like we sometimes feel as human beings. But so too can we put those pieces back together. Instead of using the 14 karat gold that the Japanese use in kintsugi art, that 14 karat gold is love. So remember, if you're having a hard day or if somebody else is, there's always a way to put the pieces back together. Just remember to do it with love.
Very touched. I have nothing to add. Thanks for the prayer, because I received it as a prayer for those who listen and the many more who can't listen, but where the ripple effects of those listening in and receiving more light and shining brighter, yeah, can create their ripple effects. Jennifer, I'm very grateful meeting you, and yeah, Thanks for the podcast. Thanks so much.